Welcome to this Jemo content presentation. Today we will be looking at the etymology of the word canon, its contemporary application to the popular music of the last half century, and some attempts at canonizing the most successful artifacts of that time period. The word canon, as we may find in the Webster's New International Dictionary, second edition unabridged, has quite a long entry, as we can see here. The history, or etymology of the word, shows us that it is from the Latin word for measuring line, rule, or model. Itself from the Greek canon, with a K, also meaning rule or rod. Like perhaps all words that identify abstract concepts, the word is akin to something that you can point to, the Greek word canna, or reed. So you can kind of imagine these people pointing out an object that was long and straight, a reed, and using it to measure things. Then the process of measuring becomes noticeable, and it itself, if someone wants to name it, the idea of measuring, it needs a word, and canon becomes useful. But there are many things you can do with this idea. The second definition of the word tells us, in general, a law, rule, or decree, not ecclesiastical, especially a law or principle accepted as true, axiomatic, fundamental, in conformity with good usage or practice, or the like. Already notice that we're really just saying the same thing in different ways, almost like defining a word with itself. But if we pull away from our understanding of these words just a little, we can actually see how, in some more objective way, all words are the same kind of thing, vehicles capable of taking in elements of their surroundings and storing some sort of meaning, being useful in some way. In one way of looking at it, all words are defined circularly. Words are objects in a system that functions with certain rules. A dictionary itself has certain rules, and only can define using other objects in itself. It is an authority unto itself, where you, the observer, must bring something into it in order for the objects inside to be useful. It's kind of a bin that contains all the words that people use. Any system works in a similar fashion. So if we're, instead of interested in words, interested in records, we have a system already there for us, all the records that exist. But how do we decide what goes in the bin to save? Undoubtedly, there is more music in the world than can fairly be listened to in a lifetime, even if one was devoted to such things. How do we even categorize the differences? Returning for a moment to the word canon, we see that part of the definition talks about the canons of art, of taste, of good society. Specifically, a critical standard, a criterion, a means of discrimination, a test. This is the sense of the word we are interested in here. By what test, what standard, what criterion can we discriminate the albums that exist? In other words, how do we determine what record should be in the bin? Again, returning to the word canon, the fourth definition Webster's gives us is a list, a catalog, a table. In essence, and this is not an earth-shattering idea, we can use a list as a standard by which to sort through the records, or whatever else it is that we want to canonize. At this point, though, we run into the problem of subjectivity, if we hadn't already. Music is very personal, so to say one thing is better or more worthy of being preserved for posterity than another thing is invariably going to be subjective. We could, of course, take the route of saying most popular, using something like record sales as an indicator number of plays on Spotify or YouTube or something of that nature. But there are at least two problems there. First, it's still inherently subjective at its core. Individual people have made the choice to buy that record or listen to that song. It is perhaps more objective to say that 1 million people say this is good makes it good, instead of to say, I think it's good makes it good. But the only thing that's really objective about that is that one number is bigger than the other. The other problem, well, the history of creative ideas is littered with examples of artists and thinkers who never made it into the popular realm, but who nevertheless had an important impact. Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave. The Brandenburg concertos were never performed in Bach's lifetime. I mean, if we went by this, we'd say that Ed Sheeran, who has more Spotify listens than Mozart, is better than Mozart. So with this said, we can probably do whatever we like. Posterity judges art differently than its contemporary patrons, since, it's different people. What kind of person spends the time to make a video about the rock canon? And furthermore, what kind of person spends the time watching this way,
it?
I've chosen to look,
do you ever have a car where the differences, subtle difference, tires were all recording styles, misaligned, and if you got to a certain speed on the highway, rattling and rattling and rattling. That's what it's kind of.
The video is a system. Just look at all the pixels around me. Of course, to me, now, I'm not stuck in the video with the limitations imposed by its code, but in a universe which may or may not be a stable system, where maybe imposing a system on it will always fall short, because we have to build into the lines and rules and axioms our experience of them.
Now, the lists themselves, the VH1 Top 100, released in 2001, and the Rolling Stone 500, released in 2003, have a few things going for them. First, they were early lists, and so influential in the way that people think about the greatest of all time when they're making their own list. And being far enough away from the golden age of rock and roll gave some sort of perspective. Furthermore, they were composed, at least ostensibly, by the opinions of multiple experts. Now, you could certainly say, what makes an expert? By what standard or rule or axiom were these experts judging the worth of the records, etc.? These questions are reasonable. However, given the subjective nature of the pursuit, it probably doesn't matter what reason we give, just that we do it. And these two lists exist. Thereby, they themselves could be used as the standard. Taking the two lists together, we see certain patterns. There are 9 records who average in the top 10, 12 that exist in the top 20 on both lists, and 14 that average in the top 20. Why these numbers? I suppose it's just as arbitrary as anything. Why not have a 15th? Why not stop at 10? But it renders a list that any scholar of rock music is unlikely to balk at. Which of these records would you say, out and out, is not a classic example of the genre? If the purpose is to maintain for posterity examples worth keeping, then, well, imagine a top 10 list of albums in 800 years. Certainly they won't care that Nirvana is lumped in with the Beatles, or that Marvin Gaye coexists with Bob Dylan, or with the Velvet Underground. Those who care at all, that is. Most people will be listening to Ed Sheeran the 48th, and the list of great rock albums will be pretty much consigned to the experts of that era, people who in 2820 study the 20th and 21st centuries, specifically its music. And presumably these will all be familiar to those people, if they still exist at all. But your average person, think about it. How many people who were alive on the planet Earth from the years 1200 to 1299 AD can you even name? I mean, anyone at all. Kings, artists, scientists. If you're not a scholar of that time period, you may have some difficulty with it. You may come up, drag a name out after a few guesses. But most people, your average person, is not going to care much about the difference in time period between William and the Magna Carta or Charlemagne. To those born afterwards, the Beatles exist in the same nebulous past as Alexander and Zoroaster and Thales. So why do we do it? Why have these discussions about whether London Calling is really better than the first Ramones album, or if Revolver is really better than Pet Sounds, or if album X really deserves to be on the list instead of album Y? Why do we care in the first place? I suppose the only way to answer that would be to first answer the question, why do we care to do anything at all?